But here is what I want you to notice, because this is where the story gets really interesting. Even after you strip away the fictional woman, even after you show the world that Diao Chan never existed, the story of her guilt is still told. People still say she destroyed the empire. She is still blamed. She is still remembered as dangerous. Even a woman who never lived is not safe from being assigned blame. And that tells us something important about why this story was constructed in the first place. Here is what happened to the Han Dynasty after Dong Zhuo's death. Nothing good. Absolutely nothing. Lu Bu killed Dong Zhuo in 192. And within months, Dong Zhuo's former subordinates, Li Ju Guosi, the same people who had been terrorized and brutalized by his regime, swept back into Chang'an. They killed Wang Yun. They killed Lu Bu as allies. They essentially recreated everything Dong Zhuo had done. By 195 AD, the imperial court was in chaos. The emperor was fleeing for his life. Regional warlords were declaring themselves independent. The Han Dynasty, the dynasty that Diao Chan supposedly saved, was already functionally dead. It limped on for another 25 years in a purely nominal sense. But the real power was gone. The real unity was gone. The real empire had collapsed. And none of it had anything to do with a beautiful woman and a seductive plan. The Han Dynasty died from causes that had been building for decades. For a full generation before Diao Chan ever appeared in a story, the empire was rotting from the inside. Let me give you the real autopsy. Starting in the 2nd century AD, the Han Empire began a slow-motion collapse driven by 5 compounding structural failures. First, the eunuch problem. The emperors of the Eastern Han were, with very few exceptions, placed on the throne as children. And when you put a child on the throne, you need a regent. The regents in Han Dynasty China were almost always either the empress's family, the consort clans, or the emperor's closest palace servants, the eunuchs. And these two groups fought each other for control of the throne for over 100 years. They would take turns ousting each other. Every time one group took power, they would use it to enrich themselves, eliminate rivals, and block any reform. This cycle of eunuch versus consort clan power struggles paralyzed the government. Second, the party purge. In 166 AD and again in 169 AD, the imperial court conducted massive crackdowns on scholars and officials who criticized the government. These were called the party purge or the Dangu Jihua. Thousands of the empire's most educated and capable people, the people who would have been the natural administrators and advisors of the government, were arrested, exiled, or executed. The message was clear. If you speak truth to power, you will be destroyed. The imperial court essentially fired its own brain. Third, the economy. Land concentration in the late Eastern Han reached catastrophic levels. Wealthy families acquired more and more land. They built walled estates. They hired private militias. They took in displaced farmers as tenants. The freeholding peasant class, the backbone of the Han tax base and military, was shrinking. The empire's financial foundation was collapsing. Fourth, the Yellow Turban Rebellion of 184 AD. This was a massive peasant uprising driven by the desperation of ordinary people who had been ruined by the economic crisis and ignored by a paralyzed government. The rebellion was eventually suppressed, but it demonstrated two things. The imperial military was not strong enough to protect the people, and the people had lost all faith in the dynasty's ability to govern. The empire was already in a state of crisis decades before Dong Zhuo arrived. And fifth, military governors. After the Yellow Turban Rebellion, the court had no choice but to grant military governors, regional warlords, real independent power to suppress local rebellions. Once you give a warlord an army and independence, you have planted the seeds of permanent fragmentation. And that is exactly what happened. By the time Dong Zhuo entered the capital in 189 AD, the empire was already a collection of armed camps waiting for the signal to break apart. Dong Zhuo did not cause the collapse of the Han Dynasty. He was a symptom of it. He was what happens when an empire has already rotted from within and is waiting for someone to apply pressure. So here is the real question. If Diao Chan never existed, and if the fall of the Han Dynasty had nothing to do with any woman, then why did the story of Diao Chan get invented? Why did Luo Guanzhong spend an entire chapter building her up as the most dangerous woman in China? The answer is simple. And it is the same answer to why the Trojan War was blamed on Helen. It is the same answer to why Cleopatra was blamed for the fall of Rome. It is the same answer to why every failed empire in human history has reached for a woman's face to explain its collapse. Because men cannot admit that they destroy themselves. It is easier to imagine a beautiful woman using her body to bring down an empire than to admit that the empire was already broken, that the system had already failed, that the powerful men in charge had already made the decisions that led to ruin. A seductive woman makes the collapse someone else's fault. It makes the men who failed the heroes. It makes the empire's death a tragedy caused by love and beauty, rather than a tragedy caused by incompetence, corruption, and structural decay. Diao Chan was invented so that men could tell a story in which men were not responsible for what happened. And the most brutal part? They invented her so thoroughly, so compellingly, that even people who know she was fictional still think of her as dangerous. Still think of her as the woman who destroyed an empire. Even as a fictional character, she is on trial. That is the real story of Diao Chan. Not a woman who destroyed a dynasty. A woman who was destroyed not once but twice. First by the empire's collapse, and then by the empire's need to blame someone for that collapse. So here is what I want you to take away from this episode. The next time you hear that a woman ruined a kingdom, ask 2 questions. First, is she even real? And second, what was actually broken long before she supposedly showed up? Because the empire was already falling. Diao Chan just gave them a face to put on it. And the funny thing is, she did not even have a face of her own. This is the first episode of a new series. A series about the women that history blamed for everything. From Diao Chan to the women who came after her. We are going to look at every case where a civilization pointed at a woman and said, "This is why we fell." Some of them existed. Some of them did not. But all of them were scapegoats. If you know a woman in history who has been blamed for something that was not her fault, put her name in the comments. Let us build this list together. Because I suspect it is going to be a very long one. And I will see you in the next one. Let me tell you about the woman who destroyed an empire. Her name is Diao Chan. She was so beautiful that a warlord gave up his kingdom for her. She orchestrated one of the most famous political assassinations in history using nothing but her body. They called her the most dangerous woman in China. Here is the truth that your history textbook never told you. Diao Chan never existed. Not in any record. Not in any document written during her supposed lifetime. Not in the official histories of the Han Dynasty. She is the only woman in the Four Great Beauties of Chinese history who is completely fictional. And that is precisely the point. See, here is how the story usually goes. In the late 2nd century, the Han Empire was in its death spiral. A warlord named Zhuo had seized control of the capital, deposed the emperor, and was essentially running the government like a military dictatorship. The court was terrified. Nobody could touch him. He had an army. He had power. And he had no reason to fear anyone. Except, according to the legend, he had one weakness. A beautiful young woman named Diao Chan. Now the story goes like this. Diao Chan was the adopted daughter of a minister named Wang Yun. She was drop-dead gorgeous. She was also a patriot. When she saw what Zhuo was doing to the empire, she agreed to a plan. She would seduce both Zhuo and his adopted son Lu Bu. She would drive a wedge between them. She would turn the son against the father. And she would bring down the tyrant. And it worked. In the famous scene at the Phoenix Pavilion, Lu Bu caught Zhuo alone with Diao Chan. He saw what was happening. He flew into a rage. And soon after, Lu Bu killed Zhuo with his own halberd. One woman. One assassination. A dynasty saved. That is the story. That is what people believe happened. But let me show you what actually happened. Because those are 2 completely different stories. Let us start with the woman herself. There is no Diao Chan in the book of later Han. There is no Diao Chan in the records of the 3 kingdoms. There is no Diao Chan in any contemporary document from the year 192 AD. What do we have? One sentence. One single sentence in the official history of the later Han Dynasty, in the biography of Lu Bu. Lu Bu had an affair with a palace maid who served Zhuo. That is it. That is the entire historical record of the woman who supposedly destroyed an empire. A palace maid. No name. No backstory. No tragic origin. No plan to save the Han Dynasty. And what happened to her? The history book does not say. She disappears right after that sentence. Because in the real historical record, she was nobody. She was a footnote, a whisper, a rumor. Everything else, the adopted daughter, the beauty, the patriotic scheme, the Phoenix Pavilion, the two-timing between father and son, all of that was invented. Layer by layer. By storytellers. By playwrights. By a novelist writing over 1,000 years later. The first version of the Diao Chan story appeared in a Yuan Dynasty tale called The Pinghua of the Three Kingdoms. In that version, Diao Chan was not even a virgin sacrifice for the nation. She was a married woman. Her name was Ren Hengchang. She was Lu Bu's actual wife. They had been separated. She ended up in Minister Wang Yun's household as a servant. And the famous scheme was not her idea. It was Wang Yun using her as a pawn to get her husband to kill Dong Zhuo so she could reunite with him. In other words, in the earliest version of this story, she was not a patriotic hero. She was a desperate woman trying to get back to her husband. And the storytellers who invented her had a different agenda than accuracy. They had drama. Then the playwrights got hold of her. The Yuan Dynasty drama The Cloudy Pavilion. The secret strategy of the link trap gave her a full backstory. A tragic past. Noble motivations. She became the woman who sacrificed herself for the Han Empire. Then finally Luo Guanzhong, the author of Romance of the Three Kingdoms, the novel that was written around 1400, about 1,200 years after the events, took all of these layers of legend and polished them into the version that the entire world knows today. He removed the part about her being Lu Bu's wife. He made her Wang Yun's adopted daughter. He gave her the beauty and the courage and the strategy. He made her the center of the most famous political murder in Chinese history. And he made her up. Completely. From scratch. Now let us talk about what really happened. Because Dong Zhuo absolutely did die in 192 AD. Lu Bu absolutely did kill him. The political assassination absolutely did take place. So what really happened? Let me give you the real story of the fall of Dong Zhuo. And it has nothing to do with Diao Chan. Dong Zhuo was a military warlord. He came to power through a combination of military force and political manipulation. In 189 AD, after the death of Emperor Ling, he was invited into the capital by General He Jin to help deal with the eunuch faction that had essentially hijacked the imperial court. He Jin was assassinated by the eunuchs before Dong Zhuo arrived. Dong Zhuo entered the capital, found the young Emperor Shao hiding in a village with his officials, and essentially took control. He disbanded the existing army. He installed his own men. He forced the emperor to move to his own base in Chang'an. He burned Luoyang to the ground behind him.
he挖了皇帝的坟墓.
He terrorized the court. He was a dictator in the most literal and brutal sense. So why did he die? Because he made enemies. Lots of them. The court officials hated him. The imperial family hated him. The regional warlords, people like Yuan Shao and Cao Cao, were openly preparing to march against him. He had so thoroughly alienated every power center in the empire that his own adopted son Lu Bu, a man who had every reason to stay loyal because Dong Zhuo had raised him and given him power, Lu Bu wanted him dead. Lu Bu wanted him dead for a very specific reason. Dong Zhuo had thrown a halberd at him. In the historical records, Lu Bu and Dong Zhuo had a heated argument. Dong Zhuo was so enraged that he threw his halberd at Lu Bu. He missed. The incident created a deep rift between them. Wang Yun, an official who had connections to both men, saw the opportunity. He approached Lu Bu. He played on Lu Bu's personal grievances. He convinced him that killing Dong Zhuo was both politically advantageous and personally satisfying.